Hey guys, as promised in the previous tutorial where we created a backend infrastructure for a recipe sharing app and secure the endpoints using JWT, we're going to delve deeper into JSON Web Tokens, explain what they are, how they can be used, what they are actually made of, and how we can secure APIs and create protected routes on the front end. We're going to implement a strategy called Defense in Depth where we put the security on both the front-end route and the back-end endpoints. So not only will there be a layer of protection on certain routes on this React application, they will also be protected on the backend supported by the Node.js. And I'm going to explain how we're going to use JWT on the backend and create this strong defensive mechanism. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below. It helps the channel a ton as I'm committed to creating more and more front-end, back-end, and full-stack development tutorial. JSON Web Token is a way to represent information between two parties, and it is often used for authentication and information exchange in web applications. In simpler terms, it's a way to create some sort of information, send it to a server, and then the server will send something back toward your computer. So you're basically sending some sensitive information like your username, email, and password to their server, and the server is encoding those information and then turn it into some weird alphanumeric value, which we call it in this case JSON Web Token, and then put it somewhere on your computer. So you can see this analogy. So there is a text, some specific information coming from your machine, and then the result is a certain envelope, for example, a certain sort of data structure saved on your machine. JSON Web Token is comprised of three main parts: the header, the payload, and the signature. And before I explain what every single part here is, I would like to tell you that this is the result of signing in. You are not creating this JSON Web Token. You are just signing in, putting your username and password, and the result is something like this, which will be used for subsequent or future requests. So let's say you have signed in and this JSON Web Token is created and saved somewhere on your browser, somewhere on your computer. So it is made up of three parts, three different values. The first part is the header that tells exactly what kind of algorithm we're using to encode this value. The red part here is the encoded version of the header. When decoded, it typically consists of two main parts: the algorithm that is used for signing, and the type, which refers to JWT. In this case, we're using JSON Web Token, not any other sort of tokens. The second component of JSON Web Token is the payload. You can see it in green here. Payload is a section where we decide what kind of information to be put there. So once subsequent requests are being made, that kind of information will be evaluated on the backend, and backend decides whether this person is authenticated or not. So there are tons of different information that we can include inside the payload, like the subject, the name, some IDs, but it's critically important not to include sensitive information like a password. Of course, there are other sort of information or claims that can be attributed to the payload, like issued time, the time of issuance, or the expiration time where this JWT is supposed to be expired and obsolete. And the third component of JWT is the signature component. It's actually a cryptographic signature which ensures the integrity of this JSON Web Token. In simpler terms, your server understands if the user is authentic or not. Is this the real person who has already created this JWT, or is this JSON Web Token already tampered with, hence not a proper JWT or not a proper token? For a better understanding, I would like to take this analogy, for example.
Think of a sealed envelope which consists of three main parts: the seal, the content of that envelope, and the signer or the signature written down behind that envelope, right? So the seal is a tool which has kind of protected the content, but it is not super strong. So it has not encrypted the content, but well, it has created some layers of protection. The content, which in our analogy is the payload, is whatever written inside that envelope. And the signature refers to the person who has created this whole setting of envelope and signed it and then sealed it. So once a user logs in and get authenticated, this envelope, this JWT, would be interchanged between different services. And as long as it is not expired, it can be a good way to authenticate the user and make the server understand who is using a certain service. But once again, this is a temporary token. It will expire within a certain period of time, and once it is expired, it is no longer useful, and the server understands this and doesn't allow subsequent requests to go through. In this project, we're going to create two routes. The first one, the main one, is where the user will see this sign in, sign up screen. So they will get a chance to sign up using their own email and password. And once they sign in, they can see something about themselves. For example, here, the user can have access to the username. Let's sign up again using a new username. I'm going to go with Bob123 and password 123. Click on sign up. And the sign in, got the same values here. I'm going to sign in. Now I'm redirected to the About page. As you can see, this value is automatically provided because I am authenticated as Bob123. Now I'm going to click on Logout, and then I'm logged out. So imagine someone is about to go to the About screen without being authenticated, without logging in. As you saw it, the user will be redirected to the main screen, local 3000. And I'm going to do it again. I'm not authenticated. I'm going to go to About, and then it will automatically be redirected to the main route. What if someone is using wrong credentials? So instead of 123, let's say someone enters 1234, which is a wrong password. I'm going to click on sign in, and I get this value, invalid password. Let's jump over the code. I'm going to create a new terminal and cd into a directory which is already created. You can feel free to create your own directory and name it whatever you want. This is where I'm going to create my project. Within this directory, I will create two folders, one for backend and the other for frontend. So let's open a new window on VS Code. You can use code period to create a new window. Okay, now I'm going to create the backend folder first and create all the codes for the backend. Make directory, backend, and cd backend. Let's initialize the project. Let's install Express. This project, I'm going to use the following middleware: course, JWT, and bcrypt for encryption.
If you open the backend folder inside the get.json, you can see that these dependencies have been successfully installed. Bcrypt for encryption, CORS, Express, and JSON Web Token. Let's create a server file and import the dependencies as well as the Express. Let's define the port. We're not going to use any real database here, so we're just going to define an empty array to represent the in-memory space to save data. For a real project, of course, you can go ahead with a relational or non-relational database. We're going to also use the middleware here. Let's listen to port 1000. Template strings here. Now let's go ahead and define our very first backend endpoint. We're going to first create the sign up section. Let's create a post request here. And define the endpoint. And let's call it sign up. This is going to be an asynchronous function. So make sure to add the async keyword here. We need to define a try-catch block here and implement the main logic inside the try part. First of all, we need to have access to the username and password coming from the client. So this is going to be part of the body of the request. And once we get these two values, we need to check whether the username is already part of the user's array. In other words, we need to check whether it exists in our database or not. If it's a repetitive username and it already exists, then an error needs to be raised. So if users contain value, if it consists of a value with the similar username, then that is not a good username. An error should be raised there. So I'm using the find method here, and I'm checking whether the username inside the hypothetical database is exactly the same as the one that the client enters. One coming from the user. If it does exist, then we need to return an error,
a response with status code 400, indicating that, well, this is not a proper username because it already exists. Assuming that the username is not repetitive, this conditional statement would not go through. So the first step that we need to take here is to hash the password and then create a new user and then put it inside the database, or in this case, this in-memory storage space, the users array. So let's hash the password using the bcrypt library, which we already installed. All we need to do is to require it and import it inside the server file. So let's call this value password. And let's use the bcrypt library. React.js. And here, we're not going to directly save the password. So the password would be encrypted with a weird alphanumeric value, which would be almost impossible to be tampered with. And to do so, we're going to use this library, bcrypt, and use its hash method. It's going to get the password entered by the user, the one coming from the client, and a certain value, a certain number, which would add complexity to create this password. You can add any number, the higher the number, the more complex or the harder it is for an attacker to tamper with the hashed value. However, it would be way better to select something between 10 to 12, because it's a trade-off. If you just add a very large number, then it can reduce the performance of your application. So 10 is a standard number and definitely would make a very strong hashed value. Once again, we don't intend to save the exact password and put it inside our database. It's not a safe approach. We need to distort that password value with something that is almost impossible to be reverted to its original value. That's why we're using the bcrypt library. And so far, we're not using anything regarding the JWT. I will explain it further down the road. So the next step is to push this value inside the database. I'm going to use this hypothetical database, users array, and then push this value, this new username and password. The username would be exactly the same as what the user is entering on the client side, but the password is that distorted value, that hashed value we already take care of. I'm going to save this. And finally, we need to send a response. So let's return successful message. The status code would be 201. We're using 201 to indicate that something has been created and added to our database. We need to send an informative message as well as a JSON format. So let's say user created successfully.
I'm going to save this. And if something goes wrong, we need to catch it gracefully as an error. So on the catch block, I'm going to return an error with status code 500, which refers to server errors, and then an informative JSON message. Say server error. I'm going to add another key here, call it error, and get the error message directly from the server. Save that. So to recap, the user tries to make a post request through this URL, API signup. They enter their username and password. If the username is a repetitive value, then an error would be raised. Otherwise, the password would be hashed and distorted. Then it will be added to the database or this array in this scenario. And if something goes wrong along the way, the catch block would gracefully handle the error. The concept of JWT has not been discussed yet, and the signing process is exactly where we need to talk about it. So I'm going to create another post request for signing in. Let's say user tries to sign in. We need to create an asynchronous callback function here. The first step is to get access to the username and password coming from the front end, the one that user enters. It's going to be part of the request body, so I'm going to get them from the body. Once we have access to the username and password, we need to check whether this username is already in our database. If it does not exist, it means that this person is not entering a valid username. So for this, I'm going to define user here, and I'm going to use the find method, JavaScript method, to look for that specific username. There is an exact username inside the database. Then we need to go ahead and see if the password matches with the one entered by the user. The username does not exist in the first place, so we need to raise an error. So if such user does not exist, raise an error with a status code (400), a JSON message. User not found. Okay, so let's say the user is found and this person is already part of the database. We need to go ahead with the password. We need to compare the password entered by the user with the one that is already stored inside the database. So I'm going to define a new variable. Let's call it valid password. And then compare it against that distorted value, that hashed value inside a database.
Once again, we're going to use the bcrypt library, and we're going to use the compare method from bcrypt. So this takes two parameters. The first one is the password entered directly by the user. This is exactly the one that user enters on the UI. Now, the second parameter is going to be the hashed value, the hashed password that is already inside the database. If it matches with that one, in other words, if bcrypt compares it and finds out that this is a valid password, then we will move to the next step and create the token. On the other hand, if there is no match for that password or the user enters a wrong password, then this value would be false and we need to raise an error. So in case valid password is not exactly valid, then we need to return an error. So response would have status code 400, and we're going to send a message to the user telling that, hey, this is not a proper password, or you entered the wrong password. What if the username is valid, it already exists, and the password is valid either? So in this case, we need to generate the JSON Web Token and use it for subsequent requests. And to do so, we're going to create a token, a new variable called token, and then we need to use the JWT library and sign it. I'm going to import the JWT. You remember that early on I just installed it as a dependency, so I'm going to import it here as JWT, and it is from JSON Web Token. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to use the sign method, which is a way to generate this token. So the sign method can take three parameters. The first one would be the payload, and this payload would be used for future requests. So it can be an ID, it can be an object with multiple keys and values, but something that matters is that we need to attribute a value, a key value pair that can be used for future requests to identify the user. It's important not to include sensitive information like passwords or security keys. So in this specific scenario, I'm going to use the username as the key for this payload. This username is part of that user which is found as a valid user. Okay, so this is going to be the first parameter of the sign method. We know what the payload is. It's a username. Now, we need to define a private key, a security key that would help for future requests. So this is the second parameter. Let's call it JWT secret. Of course, we need to define it somewhere inside the project. I'm going to put it directly here, but for production-ready environment and real project, you need to define it somewhere safe. You need to use environment variables. So let's call it complex secret key. Can be anything as long as it is complex and a combination of different characters, then you're good to go. Once again,
This adds complexity to this token, so it wouldn't be easy for attackers or hackers to tamper with this value. And here comes the third parameter. We need to expire this this token. What if someone just steals this token, right, and use it to have access to our infrastructure? So it's important to make this token temporary, and we're going to dedicate like 1 hour for this specific token. You can feel free to attribute any time for that. So to do so, we want this token to expire in 1 hour. I'm going to save this. Once again, 3 parameters are attributed to this token. The first one was the payload, something that would make this token identifiable for future and subsequent requests. Like after you log in, then the server can identify you if you just go to certain routes. The second parameter is a private key, a secret value, which is saved somewhere safe, not here. For a real project, of course, you would save it inside the environment variable in a different file. And then the third value, or the third parameter, which would define when this token is supposed to be expired and obsolete. Let's have a quick recap on what we created so far. So we created 2 post requests. The first endpoint, API signup, that's where the user tries to sign up. So they will enter 2 values, a username like Bob and a password like 123. And then that password is hashed. So a combination of alphanumeric values would be the hashed value, and that hashed value would be saved inside the user's database, not the original one. And then the second post request was the login one, the sign in where the user tries to log in. They will enter the username and the actual password, 123 for example, and the result is a JWT or JSON Web Token would be generated. So something like this, which is comprised of 3 parts, would be generated. So what's the next step? We haven't used the JWT so far, right? So we need to store the JWT somewhere on the client, somewhere on our PC or mobile device. So the subsequent request to the server will have the token. There are various ways to store the token, and 3 of them are mentioned here. We can either store the token inside the local storage of the browser, or the session, or the cookies. Of course, there are other ways to do so, but these 3 ways are the most common approaches to store the token. All of them come with their own pros and cons, so depending on the project, you need to decide which one would fit your project. In this specific tutorial, we're going to go with the local storage, where we store the token inside the browser local storage. The next step is to create the front-end side of things. We need to see how the front-end, the React part, interacts with the server. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder, but first of all, just going to make sure that I'm inside the main directory. I'm going to create another folder beside the backend. I'm going to call it frontend. Cd to frontend folder is created. I'm going to go ahead and create a React app. Let's go with the latest version. And I'm going to create it inside the front end. I'm not going to actually create a new folder for it. So depending on the NPM version, you might end up with some errors during installing the React app. So it's quite important to read through the error and try to debug it. I will explain this further down the road. So after further investigation, I realized that my React is not quite compatible with some of the other dependencies. So it was React 19, so I decided to go with React 18. At the time of recording this video, this is the most stable version of the React for this specific project. You might need to install another version. Other than that, it was necessary for the web vitals to be also part of the dependencies. So make sure to install the proper dependencies. I'm going to go ahead and install this tree. Would highly recommend you to install based on this version. React 18, React DOM 18, and Web Vitals. Okay, now that they are installed, I'm going to go ahead and npm start. Port 3000 is already occupied, so I'm going to go with another port. So on port 3001, we can see that the React app is already running. If you've got any problem installing the latest version or version 18 of React, I would highly recommend you to take a closer look at the documentation and see what the latest command is. Other than that, you can find some useful tips and tricks on how to install React in the latest version or a specific version of React on freecodecamp.org. So the point is, if you find yourself in a situation where your React app is not quite compatible with your NPM or other packages, it's quite important to find the exact version that is quite compatible with the other dependencies. So I'm going to head back to the code and remove this default value and default shapes here. Inside the source src, we can modify values here. I'm going to add h1 tag, flow, of course, remove these classes. Save it, and yep, you can see the hello is here. Since the focus of this tutorial is mostly on JWT, I'm not going to delve deeper on some React context like creating components or some data structures. I will provide the code for you, but I will specifically focus on how JWT can be used to protect certain routes. So for that matter, part of the codes will be already created here, and I will specifically focus on the logic of those functions and the functionality of various components that are somehow connected to the backend and the concept of JWT. Other than that, you're recommended to install React Router DOM because we're going to use routes and route and browser router in order to create routes. And you remember, in this tutorial, we're going to create two routes. The first one is the home routes, the main one, and the other is going to be about. So I'm going to go ahead and install React Router DOM. I have also created a components folder here underneath the source. Within these components, there are two components, the home and the about components. The home corresponds with the main path, and the about component corresponds with the about path. If you take a closer look into the home component, as you can see, it says simple functional component with an h2 tag here. And for the about, another simple component with some div and some h1 and p tags here. So I'm going to save this and have a look here. You can see that within the about component, we have this. And obviously, this is not a protected route because everybody can see that and there is no authentication. And the main one refers to home. So let's go ahead and create the sign in, sign up component on the home section and make it a little bit more complex.
Let's head over to the home component and add three user states. The first one would refer to the username, and the second one would be the password, and a third one, which is a Boolean value, a true-false value for the sign-up status. So let's go and create this. Username and setter function set username. It's going to be an empty string. And we need to have the password with the setter function set password. It is also going to be an empty string. Let's define a Boolean value and call it is sign up. Normally, a person is not, probably has not signed up, right? So it's going to be false by default. Here is the setter function. Here comes the default value, false. I'm going to go ahead and create a form here inside the return section. So let's just remove this and just add a ternary function indicating whether the user needs to sign up or sign in. So if is sign up is true, then they should see sign up. Otherwise, they need to see sign in. And I'm going to add the form here. Form is supposed to have a handler on submit. It's going to trigger a function called handle submit. Let me save it and create a simple handle submit function here. Inside the form, we're going to create two inputs, one for the username and the other for password. So each input needs to have some attributes. Let's define the type first. Username is supposed to be a text. It also needs to have a placeholder. The placeholder should read username. And it needs to have access to a certain value. This certain value would come from the value of the user states hook. So it's going to have username, the one coming from here, and it also needs to have the onChange handler. So it needs to react toward any change inside the input. Once the user is typing down something there, it needs to just react. So to do so, I'm going to populate the value of the username using the setter function. So once the user is typing down something, it's going to have access to the e.target.value. we're going to implement something quite similar for the password with some slight changes. The type is supposed to be password. We don't want the values to be visible, so it needs to be defined as password. So it's gonna have a placeholder to make the UX quite applicable and usable, of course. It's gonna read as password. Needs to have a value. The value would be coming from the password value from this user state. Once the user is typing down something inside the placeholder, an onChange handler needs to react. So it's going to be a function which set the value of the password. So I'm going to use the setter function of the password, and it's going to have access to the eTarget or event target dot value, the one value written down from the user inside the password. So it's going to populate this. Other than these two inputs, we're going to need to have a button as well. This button needs to have a type as well. So it would trigger the handle submit inside the form. The textual value of this button would depend on the value of isSignup. So it's going to be either sign up or sign in. I'm going to add a similar ternary function here. Save this. Let's save this and run the app. Start. New port. And here it is. We can see that two inputs have been created. And here's the sign in. Now, if I change the value of isSignup to true, then it needs to change as well. So it's sign up and user signs up. We're going to create another button outside the form. It's going to have an onClick handler. And it is supposed to change the status of this, which indicates whether the user wants to sign up or sign in. So all I need to do is to use the setter function here, set isSignup, and change it to the opposite value of whatever isSignup is. If it's true, it's going to turn it into false. And if it's false, it's going to turn it into true. And the button also needs to read two different texts depending on the value of isSignup. So I'm going to define another ternary here. If it is true, then let's have the following text for that button. Already have an account. Sign in, which helps a person navigate toward the sign in section because they already signed up. Otherwise, if it is false, which is the default value of isSignup, let's turn it into false. Default value is that the person has not signed up yet. So if it is false, then this person definitely needs to sign up first. So create an account, sign up first. I'm going to save this. Let's head back to this, and yep, you can see that this is clickable. When you click on it, the status of sign up or is sign up changes. So the other values correspondingly change as well. And this is also true for the other application. If it is going to be signing, then this text needs to be shown here. We're going to create another button outside the form. It's going to have an on-click handler. And it is supposed to change the status of this, which indicates whether the user wants to sign up or sign in. So all I need to do is to use the setter function here, set is sign up, and change it to the opposite value of whatever is sign up is. If it's true, it's going to turn it into false. And if it's false, it's going to turn it into true. And the button also needs to read two different texts depending on the value of is sign up. So I'm going to define another ternary here. If it is true, then let's have the following text for that button. Already have an account. Sign in, which helps a person navigate toward the sign in section because they already signed up. Otherwise, if it is false, which is the default value of is sign up, let's turn it into false. Default value is that the person has not signed up yet. So if it is false, then this person definitely needs to sign up first. So create an account, sign up first. I'm going to save this. Let's head back to this, and yep, you can see that this is clickable. When you click on it, the status of sign up or is sign up changes. So the other values correspondingly change as well. And this is also true for the other application. If it is going to be signing, then this text needs to be shown here. Now it's time to modify the handle submit button here. So the handle submit function needs to be an asynchronous function. So I need to add it here. And it also needs to have access to the event. So parameter would have access to the event. We need to prevent the default behavior. We just want to have a stable form. We don't want everything to be destabilized. So we need to use the prevent default, which prevents the default behavior of the form. Other than that, there are two routes, two endpoints on the backend. One is for sign up and the other is for sign in. So I'm going to define another ternary function to decide which endpoint is necessary for the handler to make a call to. So I'm going to define this const endpoint. So it's either going to be API sign in or API sign up based on the backend endpoints. API sign up or API sign in. And now it's time to define the ternary function. If this is sign up true, then we want the endpoint to be this, API sign up. Otherwise, we need it to be API signing. I'm going to delete this console log here. And I'm going to define a try-catch block. Inside this try-catch block, we're going to make a call to either of these two endpoints. So let's call it response. It is an asynchronous function, an asynchronous call. We're going to use fetch. And we're going to make a call to our backend. Just create a different terminal and run the backend as well. I think it is running in port 5000, so I need to take a look at it. So probably there is something wrong with port 5000. I need to dedicate a port that is not occupied. So I just canceled the other application that was running on port 5001. It is not occupied any longer. I'm going to run the server again. Okay, it is listening to port 5001. Now we need to define the URL for this fetch. So I'm going to go ahead and use template strings as we need to switch between API sign up and API signing. Thus, we need to have a dynamic value dedicated to this part. So I'm going to use HTTP localhost the backend port 5000, and here comes the dynamic value endpoints. Save this. I would also like to add another value here. We need to define the method for sending data, so it's a post request. So the method is a post. We also need to define headers, just like what you do on Postman whenever you are testing APIs. So content type is JSON, right? So I'm going to define application JSON as the content type here. Let's also define the body. It's going to be stringified. And the content that we are sending to the backend are username and password. So the username and the password would be here as a stringified value sent to the backend. I'm going to save this. Let's also populate the error block here. If something goes wrong, we need to have an alert saying, well, something went wrong or an error occurred when submitting. Or I'm going to save this. Let's also get rid of this redundant bracket here. I'm going to save this. Now that we have created the response, we need to see it somehow, right? So I'm going to define a new variable. Let's call it data. And use the await. And it's going to have access to the JSON of this response. We'd also like to use a log here. Let's call it data. and this is going to show what the data coming from the backend. So we need to now make a call to our backend and see what is brought over here. Let's have a quick look at the server. We already created the sign up within try catch block, and then there was this sign in. Okay, this is not within a try catch block, so I'm going to go ahead and put the main logic inside a try catch block. Just gonna copy everything here, put it here, find an error message with a status code 500 indicating that there is a server related error happening. Server error. And here comes the specific error message. I'm going to save this. And you remember, the whole point of creating a sign-in endpoint was to send a JSON Web Token. So let's not forget to send a JSON Web Token. So this is a successful call, status code 200, and we will send the token here as well. Let's have a quick test. I'm going to navigate into the frontend folder and then create another terminal to have the backend running simultaneously. Make sure to cd into the backend folder to start the server and start the client. Backend is successfully running on port 5000, and we've got the frontend as well. I'm going to open the console section. You can feel free to click here, the console section, or if you're a Mac user, you can use Command Option J, or if you're a Windows user, you can use Control Shift J. So I'm going to enter some values here. Let's sign someone up here. Let's call it Bob. And the password is 123. So we're going to make a call to the sign up on the server. This endpoint will be called as a post request. I'm going to click on sign up and we'll look at this. We've got some information here, data, which is part of our front end coming from the home components. And we are having access to the data coming from the backend. This is exactly the kind of data that we're looking for from this try-catch block. And this is exactly the message we're looking for, user created successfully. Now, I'm going to click again on the bottom here. And I'm going to sign in this person. Let's enter a wrong password, 1234. Okay, got another message, invalid password. And what if I go with the correct one, 123, and look at this. This is a successful sign-in, and I've got the token. So the token is generated on the back end, and then it is sent over to the front end. We haven't used this yet. We haven't stored it yet. So we need to create a mechanism to store it somewhere on our front end. And we're gonna go with the local storage. Before creating the local storage, I would like to have a look at the CSS file here
and modify the code so the whole component looks a little bit better. So I'm going to delete all the previous one. I have already created some CSS codes here. I'm just going to save this and head to the app.js and import it. I'm using this class, so I'm going to use Authcontainer as a class name for the logging logout section or the sign in sign up section. So let's call the class name Authcontainer. I'm going to save this. And yeah, it's a little bit more beautiful, right? Since CSS is out of the scope of this tutorial, I don't want to delve deeper into it. You can feel free to download the code and see what kind of CSS codes I have used here. Once the token is saved within the local storage, we need to have access to it from various components. So the best place to put it is somewhere inside a context file, and then create a provider to provide accessibility to various routes and various components. If you would like to learn more about Context API and how dynamic data and states are distributed within different components inside an application, you can feel free to have a look at the other tutorial I created. So I provide the link here. I'm going to create a folder inside the source. Let's call it Context. Within the context, I'm going to create auth context. Let's call this auth context. And we're going to use create context, which comes from the React, and attribute the initial value here. We're going to create a provider. And passing the children. We will return the provider along with the auth context. Inside this, we need to have access to values that will be passed along to children. Of course, we need to export using use context. Context hook is automatically imported here. And within this hook, we need to import the auth context. Save this. This context will be considered a centralized place where we can have access to various dynamic data and states. So I'm going to define token state, authentication status state, and the user state here, and then I will provide accessibility to these variables through different parts of our application. So let's go ahead and define the token first, the setter function, set token. Let's use the user state hook here. This is exactly where we have access to the local storage. I'm going to use the local storage get item, which is a way to have access to that item, and attribute an arbitrary name to the place where the token is going to be saved. I'm going to call it auth token. You can feel free to call it whatever you like. So either this exists or doesn't. And in this case, we haven't stored it yet. So it will normally be null. The next state that I'm going to define here is the authentication status. So either a user is authenticated or not. Let's call it is authenticated. And the setter function set is authenticated. Just the user state hook here. And this is going to be based on a conditional statement. So I'm going to use a ternary function here. If the token exists, we know that someone has been authenticated. So this is going to be true. If it doesn't, then no one is authenticated. Save this. I'm going to go ahead and define the third one, the user. This is the state that we're going to use it in the future to show on the about route. So once the user is authenticated and is automatically redirected to the about screen, they will see their username. At the moment, there is no user, so I'm going to leave it with a string, an empty string here. So let's pass along all these variables and put them here inside the value. So in the future, the other components will be able to use them accordingly. I'm going to copy them here. Paste them over here. And the last one. Save this. Okay, so it's a combination of variables and functions, the setter functions. We will define other functions as well, so they're not necessarily supposed to be the setter functions of the user state hooks. They can be regular JavaScript functions as well. To provide access to these values, we need to bring the provider and put it somewhere here on the app, so every other component will have access to all these variables and functions. So all I'm going to do is to copy this and encapsulate everything inside the return section, and then we're good to go. We need to import it, automatically import it. I'm going to save this. Now that we have provided the auth provider for all components here, all we need to do is to save the token coming from the backend inside this. So we need to somehow have access to this set token, so whatever comes from the backend will be saved in this context. I'm going to head over to the home component and bring in the set token. This set token is one of those values defined inside the value attribute here. This is the set token coming from there. And this is part of the use auth. So I'm going to copy this. And we've got this automatically imported from there. So you remember that this console was logging the token coming from the backend. And instead of this console message, I'm going to go ahead and use this set token to save it inside the context. You remember that this handle submit function is responsible for two different functionalities. The first one was for signing up, and it had nothing to do with JWT. The user was just entering their information, and it was saved inside the database or that in-memory array here on the server. However, the other route, the API signing route, was exactly about JWT and generating a token. So we need to take this into consideration and define some conditions to take care of the token. Before moving forward with that, I would like you to see what kind of information are shown here. I'm going to create a console and get a console log out of response. So you will see exactly what this brings us. If it's an OK response, if it says successful signing in or successful signing up, then we can have the status as true. Otherwise, let's say the user is entering something wrong and a token is not being generated, then we will have a false status. So let's just see it in action. I'm going to run the backend and run the front end as well. Let's open a console. We're going to sign up someone. For example, Alexander, password 123. I'm going to sign up. And please look at these messages. User has been successfully created, and we've got a response type course, URL API sign up. It's not redirected anywhere, so it's false. And status code is 201, meaning that something new has been created. But more importantly, I would like to draw your attention to OK. The key OK points to true, meaning that this is a successful response. It didn't go through a 400 error. What if the user tries to sign in with a different password, a wrong password? So instead of 123, I'm going to go with 1234. Let's sign in. So look at this. First of all, it's an invalid password. And secondly, the response has got a different value here. So the OK is not true, meaning that somewhere on the backend, this didn't go well, or it was accompanied with a status code 400, which refers to some type of an error. Based on this OK status, based on this Boolean value, we're going to define our logic. If it's a successful request, if it's going to be at 200 or 201, then we need to deal with the token. Otherwise, no token is provided, so we need to take this into account. Okay, let's define condition here, and based on the status of OK, then we decide whether to save the token or not. I'm going to define this conditional statement. Response is OK. or the OK value is true, then we need to deal with the token. Otherwise, if the user, for example, is entering a wrong password or the username is repetitive or is not found, then first of all we need to empty these strings, so they need to be removed from here. All we need to do is to set their value to empty strings. So empty strings for the password and empty strings for the username. And that would be great if we can have access to the error message as an alert on the UI. So we would see exactly what has happened. However, what if this is a successful response? What if the user has perfectly entered the right answer, the right password, and the status code is 200 and the OK is true? So in this case, we need to be very careful about switching between these two tabs. You know, if is sign up is true, if this value is true, then we will end up with the sign up screen. Otherwise, we will end up with the sign in screen. So if the value of is sign up is false, we will see this screen. Based on this, I'm going to go ahead and define another condition here. So if is sign up, this value, which is false by default, if it is false, meaning that the user is in the sign in section, then we need to save the token. Okay, so two ifs here. Otherwise, the person is inside the sign up screen, then we need to change the status of sign up. So this switching definitely would happen between the sign up part and the sign in. So I'm going to turn this value to false. If you find this a little bit confusing, that's totally fine. All you need to know that we are doing two functionalities, signing in and signing up. And while we are switching between these two tabs, between sign in and sign up, this value needs to automatically change as well. So there's nothing complicated about it. The point is we need to get access to the generated token and save it on the set token or this value. Token is supposed to be saved here. So this is all we are doing here. Okay, so let's see what happens. I'm going to go ahead with a new user, Alice 123. There is no such user as Alice, so I'm going to sign in, and you can see that alert is triggered, user not found. You're having access to the exact same message created on the backend, and there is this response. You can see the OK value is false, which means this was not supposed to go through. Now, all we need to do is to sign up this person. So this is a new user. Let's call her Alice, password 123, sign her up, and you can see user created successfully. And the response is also OK. The OK value is true, and it's got a successful status code of 201. So even though everything was successful and we just saved the token inside a user state, still it's got nothing to do with our browser. If you head over to the console section and then the application and then click under the local storage, you don't see that auth token that we already defined. So you remember that inside the context, I just created a get item, but this auth token, that arbitrary value, has not been set yet. It should be set somewhere, right? So we need to create a mechanism through which this token is not only saved inside the token, but also it is saved and stored somewhere inside our browser. So I'm going to go ahead and define a useEffect hook, and that's exactly where we are going to set the token and actually save it somewhere on our browser. Okay, I'm going to define this useEffect. I'm going to define some condition here. If token exists, if it is not null or there is a real token, then we would like to store it using setItem method of the local storage, and then we would like to call it auth token. So this is exactly where the naming happens. This is where you define what the name is supposed to be for that token. Get item is just tries to find that one, that auth token or that arbitrary value. It's not setting up anything. So I'm gonna call it auth token or whatever that it can be, as long as they are consistent with this get item. That's totally fine. Call it auth token, and it's gonna be a key, a pair of key values, right? Auth token would be the key and token would be the value. It will be saved here. And then we're going to define a new authenticated status. You know, by default, if there is a token, this person is authenticated. Otherwise, this person is not authenticated. So let's say we're doing this under a condition where this person is not authenticated. So we need to change the status and consider this person an authenticated person. We know that there's supposed to be a dependency array here. Okay, what if there is no token? In this situation, if let's say the person has logged out and the token has been deleted, then you just want to make sure that it's removed from the browser. So we're going to use the remove item, and we're going to remove the auth token. Okay, so far we have used 3 different methods for local storage. setItem is used to define the item, to create an item and call it whatever you want. getItem is the method that you can have access to the value of that key. And in this case, this would normally look for something like a token. And the third method here is remove item, where you're totally removing that key from your browser. So we are removing that person, and that person is not supposed to be authenticated anymore. So set is authenticated will turn into false. And you might wonder, okay, under what condition is this use effect supposed to be triggered? So the condition is based on token. Whenever there is any change on token, like whenever it is created, removed, or changed, then this use effect needs to come into play and it needs to be triggered. So I'm going to set the dependency array to this variable token. So to give you a recap, I would like to draw your attention to the UI side of things. A user is normally on the sign-in screen, right? And this means that is sign up is false, right? Because it is normally false. And in any website, you normally see the sign-in section, and sign up is one step away from, your access to that website. So you decide to sign up, you click on it, you change the status of is sign up from false to true. So whatever value you put here, your username and your password, would be set on the username and password here. Now, is sign up is false. You're trying to call this endpoint, API signing. You make a call, you use this specific API. This calls API sign-in, and then a particular response is created. Normally, the status is okay because you are typically expected to enter a valid value for both the password and the username. So if it is okay, and if you're entering the correct username and password, then you need to see this switching thing happen, right? You need to see that sign up turns into sign in because you're ready to sign in with those credentials that you've already used and created. Just as I gave you the example of Alice, right? And when this goes successfully, and then a token is created, this token is generated on the backend, and then you are setting the value of token here. I would like to now draw your attention to the context. Previously, there was no token, right? But now, through the home component, you are attributing a new value. So this use effect would be triggered. I would like to use a console here to show you exactly what happens. Let's call it use effect. I'm going to save this. Now that the token has changed from null to a real token, this if statements would come into play. If there is a token, which we just created, then we would like to name it. We would like to attribute a key and call it auth token. So from now on, auth token, somewhere on our browser, will bear the value of the token. And then this means this person is authenticated, so the status needs to change to true. So let's see everything in action. I'm going to head to this. Let's just refresh everything. Use effect is just triggered as the whole application is mounted. I'm going to sign up someone. Let's call him Joe. 1, 2, 3. Let's sign up Joe. User created successfully, and the response has got OK to true. Now, let's sign in this person. 1, 2, 3. Okay, there's an issue here. Let's have a look at. Okay, so yeah, it needs to be set item. Letter T has not been added here, so let's just put T here, save it again, do everything. So let's say we have Joe, 1, 2, 3. Joe signs up. Now Joe tries to sign in. A new token is created. Response is okay. And look at this. The useEffect hook has been triggered because we are changing the value of token. Previously, there was nothing. It was null. But now it has changed. A new token has been created. And more importantly, we have set a new item. We have defined a new key. I would like to draw your attention to the Application tab here. You can see it, the console section. Let's go to Application. Under the local storage, I'm going to click on this, and here we go. Auth token, or whatever value that you have set there, bears the value of the token. This being said, for subsequent request, the guy with the username Joe and password 123 will have access to those resources. To have a quick recap, we just created the sign up and sign in function through which a user can register inside our application and log in. At the moment, we're just saving the token somewhere on our browser, the local storage, which you can see on the Application tab here. But we're not using this, right? What's the use of this token if we have created it and saved it on our browser? At the moment, if you go to the About route, you can see that it is not protected, even though this is just a template string, a template value, right? It's not a protected. Everyone can go there, even if I just remove the value of auth token and just refresh the page, well, I can still see this page, and you can see that the token has been removed. The next step is to protect this route, and I'll only allow users that are authenticated. Let's head over to app.js. What I'm going to do right now is to create a protected route and wrap this value, this component inside it. So let's just create it from here. Let's call it protected route. Gonna put about here, save it, and yep. Now, this has not been created yet, right? I'm gonna go ahead and create this one and then define the logic based on the authentication of the user. Let's create a new folder and call it utils. Inside the utils, I'm gonna create this protected route, and later on, the about component would be considered a child component for its wrapper or for its higher order component. So let's call this protected route. This is going to have access to its children. And in this case, the children, part of the children is about. And protected route is the parent component. And this is going to have a return section, and based on the authentication status, we're going to decide what's going to happen when the user navigates to route about. Let's say this person is authenticated. Then show the children, or in other words, go to the about component. Otherwise, this person is not authenticated. Navigate to the main screen or the main route. I'm going to explain what every single value here is. Just bear with me. And let's export this as protected route. You might wonder, where is this is authenticated coming from, right? So we're going to bring this from the context. Context is one layer above everything else because we already put the provider here, meaning that every single component within this provider will have access to all the dynamic values and states and information defined on auth context. So all these user states would be usable as long as they are trickling down inside the child component or inside whatever is included underneath the provider. Okay, so let's bring this on. All we need to do is to bring the context, and from the context is authenticated can be extracted. Okay, the name was auth context and we were using useAuth. Just to bring it automatically, I'm gonna remove the last letter, put it back in, click on it. Now we have access to the value of is authenticated here. Let me just remove this part because children is supposed to come from here, the parent component. In other words, the parent component, which is protected route, the main route, or the HOC higher order component is supposed to have access to a bunch of children. In this case, the about component is the children. So it's going to be passed down here. If the person is authenticated, then they need to see this, the about component. Otherwise, they need to be navigated or redirected to another route, which in this case, the main route. Back to the protected route, we're just getting the children from the parent component. And in this case, the child component is about, so about will be presented here. If the user is authenticated, then, well, the children component, in this case, the about component, will be shown to the user. Otherwise, the user will be automatically navigated to any endpoint that we just defined here. And in this case, we've defined the main component. And here there is this location and replace. Location can be a value extracted from the useLocation hook. Let me just define it here. Const location. And use the useLocation hook, which comes from the React router DOM. I'm going to save this. Let me just console log here, write location, and show you exactly the type of information and keys that it potentially contains. So I'm going to go with location. Put it here. Back to the
app.js. You remember that this has not been imported yet. So let's import it automatically. I'm going to save this. Now, if the user navigates to about, then this protected route as a higher component would come into play. And we're just trying to set the is authenticated to true and then see the children. I would like to just show you the information coming from the location. So let's just run the server and see what's behind that location. Okay, I'm going to save this again. It's on port 3000. I'm going to open the console. Let's sign up someone. Call them Paul. 1, 2, 3. Okay, now let's sign in. Okay, so Paul has signed in. A token has been created, and we can see it here. Auth token for Paul. Let's see if we can see about. Okay, so look at this. We're heading to about, and this is the kind of information which comes from that protected route, right? So this is the higher order component, and this is what we're seeing. I would also like to make a quick modification here. I need to have this children written down in lowercase letters, so let's just write it down with lowercase. Children. I'm going to save this and head back to here. So we can see that the about component is trickled down inside the higher order components protected route, and we have access to the keys, values from the location here. So the keys and values are perfectly shown here. You can see that it is comprised of the following keys: path name, search, hash, state, and key, and values like about and all the way to default. This can be useful for some analytics. You just want to know where the user is coming from, where the user is heading to, and where that navigation has taken place. It is also worth mentioning that state, here the state prop, allows you to pass additional state information to the location you are navigating to. Here, it is passing the object with a property from, and all the information related to location is the value of that prop. And the location variable typically represents the current location object, which includes information about the current URL, such as the path name, search parameters, and state. And this brings us to the other prop, replace. This prop is a boolean that, when it is set to true, indicates that the navigation should replace the current entry in the history stack instead of adding a new one. In simpler terms, this means that if the user navigates to the new location and then they click on the back button on their browser, they won't be able to be navigated back to the previous page. Chances are you're using Google Chrome, and Chrome's built-in features might override this one. So you're highly recommended to test it on your own browser with different values, with true or false, and see how it plays out. Since this is not the focus of this tutorial, I would like to draw your attention to what navigate does. We're just trying to navigate the user to the main components to this route once the user is not authenticated. Okay, let's now test the authentication status false. What if the user is not authenticated, right? So I'm going to head back to application. We know the user has already stored this value. I'm going to delete this value as if it has never been there, so we don't have any auth token here. Okay, now I'm going to refresh the page, And there is no authentication. The authentication is false, so the user is navigated to the main component. And again, if I just try to navigate to about route, just redirects back to the localhost 3000. So far, the protection has been created on the front-end layer. The user needs to be authenticated. The JWT needs to be stored on the browser in order for them to be able to have access to certain routes. And in this case, it's the about route. What if I just add an arbitrary value? Right? What if it's not JWT and instead it's something totally random? I have written auth token here and I have added a very random value. Now I'm just trying to head back to the about route and see what happens. Will I be able to see the protected route with a wrong token, or is it still protected? As you can see, this is not protected. I am not adding any valid token here, but still I can see and I can have access to that supposedly protected page. And this is not good. That's why we need to take care of it on the backend as well. And deep defense or defense in depth is the concept that needs to be taken into consideration. So the next step is to protect these routes from the second layer, from the backend layer as well. Creating a layer of protection on the backend would ensure that users with invalid tokens will not be able to have access to certain routes. So let's head back to the server file and create a middleware to take care of those protected routes on the front end. I'm going to define a function here. This can be created somewhere else inside a different folder, but since this project is quite small, I'm not going to create another folder and call it middleware. But for real projects, please make sure to make your codes as modular as possible. So I'm going to enter it here. Let's call it auth middleware. A middleware have access to the request, to the response, and it will have this next callback function here, which we will use. I'm going to define the logic here and explain what next does accordingly. So let's say the user tries to enter that certain protected route. They probably have some token. So this token needs to be validated here. I'm going to create a new variable here. Let's call it auth header. This is where our backend will try to have access to the headers. So this is part of the authorization. And this is the value of that token. If that exists, then it needs to split it and it will choose the second value. So we're going to use 1. I will definitely define a console here so you will see exactly what this splitting does. Just some basic JavaScript stuff. So let me define it here. What matters here is the header. This authentication will have access to the value of authorization, which is part of the headers. And then if that exists, we will select the second value because it's a pair and we're looking for the second one. So the second value would be selected here as the token. I'm going to console log the token as well. This is not the front end, and you will see it on the back end. Okay, now that we have access to the token, let's just create a conditional here. If the token does not exist, if this person is not providing any token, then we need to return an unsuccessful attempt. So we're going to have status code 401, and we're going to send this message to the user. You have not provided any token. No token provided. What if they are providing a token? It can be a valid token or something as arbitrary as 1, 2, 3, 4, just like what I did. And as an attacker, I was authenticated, and that was not good on the front end. This is exactly where JWT verify function comes to play. It's going to verify the authenticity of that random value or that valid value with what's on the backend infrastructure. So this is going to have access to the token provided by the front end. It's going to use its private key. You remember that private key here, right? A complex secret value, a complex value which will be defined somewhere outside here, some environment variable. Anyway, it's gonna compare it against the JWT secret key or the private key. And then here is a callback function which takes care of the possible errors. So if it's a fake token, if it is like 1, 2, 3, 4, then needs to return an unsuccessful message here, like status code 403 with this message. Invalid token. So what if there's no error? What if it's the real token? So in that case, we're going to append the user value. We're going to append this value to the request and then send it to the next route or to the next handler or any other service that is supposed to use this value. I'm going to go ahead and create a GET request that is going to use this auth middleware, and if it is successful, it's going to respond with the value of the user, with that protected value or the person who is already authenticated using this auth middleware. Okay, let's call it API protected. Second parameter would be the middleware. And here comes the last callback function. if someone has not been stopped somewhere within these conditional statement or error statement and everything has just gone smoothly and the user is appended to the request body, then we will return this response with a successful message. And we will send something like this. This is a protected route for a protected data. More importantly, this is the user who is authenticated. I'm going to save this. And in case you just want to see what this request body user is, I'm just going to the console here. Request user. Okay, so a new endpoint has been created, but before I test it on the front end, I'm going to go ahead and run Postman and provide two different scenarios. One with a real token, and two with a fake token or without any token, and see exactly what's been created, what these auth header values are, what's going to go through all these conditionals, and what a successful message would look like. Let's rerun the server and open Postman. I'm going to create a new collection from here. Let's call it JWT. Rename WT. I'm going to go ahead and create a new request here. This is going to be a GET request. Let's call it protected. And this is going to be localhost 5000 and API protected. Okay, there's something wrong with our server. Okay, something has not been handled properly. Okay, I can see that port 5000 is running somewhere else. I'm gonna cancel that and restart the server. Back to Postman. Localhost 5000 API protected. Okay. Now, all I'm gonna do is to just send a request without anything. As you can see, no token provided. This is the message that I get exactly from the middleware. So look at this. There is no auth header so far. So this is empty, right? And then no token was created here. So token is empty or undefined. And because no token was provided, I just encountered this error, no token provided, with status code 401. What if I just sign in and generate a token? So let's sign up a new user. Let's call him Joe. Password 123. Joe signs up. Then Joe signs in. The token is created. I'm going to copy the value of this token. Okay, so let me just open Postman. This time, I'm going to provide a token.
I'm going to select bearer token from the authorization tab. I'm going to paste a new value. Just want to make sure that the quotation mark is not included. Okay, it looks good. Let's make the request again. And look at this. This is a successful message with status code 200, and 2 keys have been created. The first one, this is a protected route, and the second one, we have the user, the time of issuance, and the expiration date. So it was issued right now, like a couple of seconds ago, and this is going to expire in 1 hour because it was already set to expire in 1 hour. I would also like to draw your attention to values created on both the auth middleware and this GET request. You remember the previous auth token, auth header, and token were undefined, but this is related to the most recent request that we just made on Postman. The auth header has got 2 values, bearer and the value of the token. So this is what we got here, auth header, and then we decided to split it based on the space between these 2 values, and the second value, this one, was attributed to token. So that made our first token. And then you can see that the second console here takes the exact token here. And more importantly, because everything was valid and the token was provided, it just went to the GET request here successfully. So this is the result of request user. It was successful. The next function was just proceeding to the next handler, which was the function decided here. And the result was the username, the time of issuance, and the expiration time. Let's have a quick recap. The user just tries to make a GET request to this certain protected route. So the first thing that he encounters is a middleware. The auth middleware takes care of the request coming from the UI or from the client. So it first checks whether there is a header. And you remember in the first scenario, no header was provided and it was undefined. And in the second scenario, we just manually entered a token, so the auth header was with some values here, with bearer and the value of the token. Everything was successful, so the next callback proceeded to the next handler, which was the callback function of the GET request. So 3 things happened. Stage 1, the first one, was a request made to this URL. Stage 2 was the triggering of this middleware. It was triggered, something happened, user was attributed to the request, and then it was passed over to the next handler. And the third stage was the handler, was the callback function on this GET request. So this was successful, and the result was an object which is going to be consumed on the front end. Our front end is going to use this user and then access to this username. So once they are trying to go to that protected route, this username, which is the result of a successful GET request, will be shown on the front end. And if an attacker tries to tamper with the value of this token, then they will encounter this error 403 forbidden, meaning that the token was invalid. So this ensures that the token needs to be authentic, and only authenticated users will be able to have access to their information. You might have noticed that I just manually added the value of token here, but this needs to happen on the front end. So I'm going to go ahead and add a useEffect hook here, which will make a call to this protected route as a GET request. And if it is successful, then the front end will have access to the user or the username. Otherwise, it will be blocked somewhere within the logic of this auth middleware. For example, if it is invalid or if it's not even provided. Some of these functions will block the user from accessing that specific resource. So let's just create this hook. It's going to be useEffect. And inside this useEffect, I'm going to define a new function. Let's call it verify token. And this is going to be an asynchronous function because we're going to make an asynchronous call to that certain route. And within this function, we want to define some logics. And at the end, we're gonna call this function. We also need to trigger this useEffect only when the token is changed. If there is any modification over the token, then this needs to be triggered. So we need to have access to the token as well. You remember the token was defined within the auth context. So all I'm going to do is to get it from the auth context. So, and that's why I just swapped the position of this and just brought it a little bit further up here. So let's just select the token. And the token will be value, which will trigger this useEffect. Okay, now let's just define the logic. We're going to create a try-catch block. Within this try section, we're going to have a response. And this response is going to fetch something from the backend. So this is the address. The URL is http localhost, the backend port 5000, API, and protected. Let's add the other parameters as well. This is going to be a GET request. So the method is GET. And we also need to define the headers. Authorization. I'm going to use template strings because we're going to provide a dynamic value. Bearer space. And this dynamic value is what we get from the local storage. Local storage, get item, and we just want to have access to the auth token. Save this. You can easily have access to the result of this this GET request. So I'm going to go ahead and define a new variable. It's going to be the JSON part of this response. And of course, I can console log and see the exact same message, which is the output of the server. But this is not what we're going to do. I'm going to define the logic here. So let's say the user has successfully made the request to that protected route on the backend. Now we just want to allow them to have access to our protected resources. So I'm going to define a conditional here, and it's going to be based on that response. If the response is successful, if a proper token has been provided, then we need to change the status of authentication. We're going to say, well, this person is authenticated, so is authenticated needs to turn into true. I'm going to bring along the setter function, put it here, and use it here. The user needs to be authenticated, so it's going to change to true. Okay, now that the user is authenticated, we would like to have access to the username. So we need to go through this username, and bring along the value on the front end. So all I'm going to do is to use the setter function of the user, which is here, just bringing them in from the authentication part or from the context. So this comes from the useAuth. Now let's just set the user. So this just goes through different layers of this response. Response, user, username. Okay? And what if the user is not authenticated? Or what if this is not an okay response? Something like an invalid token has been provided. So in this case, we're going to change the status of authenticated. So whatever it is, it will turn into false. That's pretty much everything about the logic. Now I'm just going to define the catch error block here. Anything happened, there was an issue, still we don't want the user to be authenticated. The verify token is an asynchronous function that makes a call to our backend and then makes sure whether the user is authenticated or not. So let's not forget to add the keyword await here, as every single line is a part of an asynchronous call. So I'm going to add await here and save it. Okay, let's sign someone up. Let's call him Joe. Password. Well, we need to be on the sign up part. Let's call the username Joe, password 123. Joe signs up. Now they can sign in. As you can see, the values of password and username are already there. You can feel free to edit them and add more logic to it, but this is not the scope of this tutorial, so we're just going to focus on the JWT. A better UI and a better UX would not have these values upon signing in. So I'm going to sign in with the password 123. Okay. User signs in. A new token has been created. And now, this specific user, Joe, would like to visit About. And as you can see, they are now authenticated and they can see this specific route. So I would like to draw your attention to the general logic. There is this person who wants to sign in and have access to a certain route. That certain route, the about route, is protected on both the front end and the back end. So he just signs in, a token is created on the back end, and it is saved on the browser, and on subsequent request, they try to have access to this about. It goes through this verification process from the UI, checks whether that token is valid. If it is, then they are provided with the children component, which was the about component. If they are not authenticated, or if the JWT is not valid, then they will automatically be navigated to the main screen. We would also like to have access to the value of username on the UI. We're just doing this whole multiple processes to bring that value here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring the value of the username here. So upon visiting the about route, they will see their name or their username here. So let's head to the about component here. We're going to bring in the user from the useAuth. Okay, it's been automatically imported. Now, I would like to put it here. Let's head back to this part, and as you can see on the UI, the user is able to see their username. Okay, let's just head back to the main URL. Let's sign up another user. Call her Alice. Password 123. Alice signs up. Then they sign in. New token has been created. Now they just want to visit this page and they can see their username here. And in case you're wondering how this user is provided to the about, once again, I'm going to draw your attention to the protected route. Once the protected route goes through the verification process and make sure that the person is authenticated, then they will set the user. And this comes from the response of this backend request. A request has been made to the backend. It was successful. It's got a response, and part of that response had the value of the username. It is set on the set user, and you remember the set user was part of the context. Now the context has got a new value. It's not empty anymore. A new username has been assigned to this. On the other hand, on the About section, we are retrieving a real value. It's not empty, but it's got the value of the username. So at the end of the day, the user will be able to see their username on this protected route. Another improvement that we can make here is to define a loading mechanism, because at the moment, this request to the backend is an asynchronous call. It might take a while, so we need to have a good loading visual on the UI so the user can have a very smooth and intuitive experience. I'm going to go ahead and define a new value. Let's call it loading, and set loading. Normally, we don't have data, so it needs to be loading. That's why I need to attribute the initial value true. Let's save it. And now, this use effect comes into play. It just runs, and then we've got this try-catch block responsible to authenticate the user. It takes a while,
but after a while, once it is successful, we need to turn the value of loading from true to false. It's no longer loading, and we've got reasonable data here to show. So I'm going to define another conditional here. If loading is true, if it is trying to find the value of the token and it takes a while, we need to show something to the user. So in the meantime, let's bring this on the UI loading. Okay, we've got an error here. Set is loading. Let me just copy the exact same value here. Set loading. Put it there. Save it again. Okay, now let's head back to the UI. Okay, I'm gonna reload this. Probably you can see the loading message here. It takes like less than a second to appear on the top left part of the screen. You can see the loading here, right? So that's exactly when we've got the value of loading as true, because it's going to take less than a second for this API call to go through and get the value of the username. In the meantime, we're showing this. Let me just change this and put an h1 tag. I'm going to save this, reload, and you can see a larger font, right? So please make sure to have a loading mechanism for any API call. It's synchronous, and it would give a really better user experience to anybody that is using your services. Eventually, we need to log out the user, so they will no longer be logged in. I'm going to go ahead and create a button here and call it logout. So this logout is supposed to nullify the value of the token, which is set on our context. So once the user clicks on the logout button, the value of this token should once again turn into null. So let's continue. We've got a button here. Let's call it logout. I'm going to save it. Okay, let's just attribute a class name here. Inside the app.css, we've got this logout button class. I'm going to copy this and put it here. Save this. I'm going to sign in as Alice. 1, 2, 3. Alice signs in and then wants to visit about. So on the protected route about, we can see that this button has been created. If I click on it, nothing happens. So all I'm going to do is to bring the value of the token, the setter function, and then turn it into null. I'm going to add the onClick here. And we're going to set the value of token to null. And I'm going to use the setter function. The setter function comes from the auth context. So I'm going to just bring in directly from the use auth. So it comes from this context. It's used here. Now I'm going to turn the value from that JWT to null. In other words, once the user clicks on the logout button, he is removing the value of the token, so he will no longer be authenticated. So let's head back to the UI.
We've got this person authenticated, seeing their username. I'm going to click on Logout, and you can see the value of the token has been removed. I'm going to draw your attention to the Application tab here. Let's have a look at this. And as you can see, there is no auth token here because it's been removed. Now, let's say someone who is not authenticated would like to visit the About route. Nothing appears because they are not authenticated. On the other hand, if they just sign in again, 1, 2, 3, and try to visit the About, they will be authenticated and they will have access to this protected route. In summary, we created 3 endpoints on the backend, 2 post requests and 1 get request. The post requests were responsible for signing in and signing up, and the get request was a backend logic to validate the authenticity of the users who were using a certain service. On the front end, we created 2 routes, one of which was a protected one, meaning that it wasn't accessible to regular user unless they were authenticated on both the front end and the back end. I also explained how this token was stored, and in this specific project, we use local storage, or the browser's local storage, to hold the value of JWT. And this concludes this tutorial. I decided to delve deeper into the theoretical and practical aspects of JSON Web Tokens and give plenty of examples about how it can be used in a real project. If you found something useful from this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. It helps the channel a ton. I am committed to creating more and more front-end, back-end, and full-stack tutorials. So, see you on the other one.